Hello, good evening. Welcome to Novara Live. My name is Aaron Bastani. Tonight, I have the pleasure of being joined by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, how are we?
Very hot. It's been very hot today. I have a fan pointed directly at me. I think people probably can see my hair blowing in the wind, but luckily, feeling much cooler now and looking forward to the show.
I think your hair looks very nice for what it's worth, I must say. I do also feel rather hot, but I'm not quite sure if I've got long COVID or heat stroke. I don't know. My brain feels like it's operating at less than 10% tonight. Let's see how I hold up. Coming up tonight, we have some really interesting stories. Elon Musk and Donald Trump have a little tete-a-tete on X, despite having to wait 40 minutes because of apparently a DDoS attack. Tom Tugendhat has given his first major speech in his campaign to be the next Tory party leader, and Britain's universities are in crisis. Iran is poised to attack Israel for the second time this year, and Western leaders have been scrambling to avert the assault. The anticipated attack would be in retaliation for Israel's assassination of Hamas political leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran last month. Amongst those trying to stop what is likely to be a significant bombardment is British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who spoke to Iran's new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, by phone last night. This image was among the set of glossy pics released by Downing Street, marking the first time a British leader has spoken to Iran's president, not their supreme leader, since 2021. During that call, Starmer is reported to have urged Iran to hold back, stressing, quote, the serious risk of miscalculation. The call came amidst reports that Iran is ramping up its preparations for a large-scale attack on Israel, with the White House saying it expects Iran, along with Hezbollah and Lebanon, to launch an assault this week. And the UK also joined with France and Germany by issuing a joint statement calling for Iran to stand down. The three nations called for a ceasefire in Gaza and said this in particular about Iran. We are deeply concerned by the heightened tensions in the region and united in our commitment to de-escalation and regional stability. In this context, and in particular, we call on Iran and its allies to refrain from attacks that would further escalate regional tensions and jeopardize the opportunity to agree a ceasefire and the release of hostages. They will bear responsibility for actions that jeopardize this opportunity for peace and stability. No country or nation stands to gain from a further escalation in the Middle East. Well, they should say no nation, except Israel, perhaps. Now, that statement gives the reader absolutely no clue, no inkling as to why this attack is likely to happen. Iranian aggression, that's all it says. But that aggression hasn't come from nowhere. What country in the world would tolerate a foreign power assassinating the political leader of another state on its sovereign territory? Would the US or the UK just let it slide? I don't think so. But when it comes to Israel, Iran is seemingly meant to accept that Tel Aviv can remotely murder people under its diplomatic protection. And if Tehran responds to that assassination, which by the way was illegal, Iran will be to blame for escalating hostilities in the region. It's a position that's not only illogical, but hypocritical too. According to Iran's official news agency, the country's foreign affairs spokesperson, Nasser Kanani, rejected the call for restraint, saying that, quote, such rude requests lack political logic, while they're also against the international laws and principles. Kanani also pointed out the wider political context, saying this. Without any objection to the crimes of the Zionist regime, the statement impudently requires Iran not to respond to a violation of its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The inaction of the UN Security Council and the extensive political and military support of Western governments to the Zionist regime are the main factors behind the regional expansion of the Gaza crisis. Iran's news agency also reported these remarks from Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. Pezeshkian stated that from the point of view of the Islamic Republic of Iran, war in any part of the world is not in the interest of any country, emphasizing that a punitive response to an aggressor is a legal right of states and a way to stop crime and aggression. Obviously, we're talking about the right to self-defense and deterrence, I would certainly agree with those comments. Using less direct channels, Iran has also indicated that an assault on Israel is not inevitable. With Gaza ceasefire talks set to restart this week, 3 senior Iranian officials have spoken to Reuters, who report this. One of the sources, a senior Iranian security official, said Iran, along with allies such as Hezbollah, would launch a direct attack if the Gaza talks fail or it perceives Israel is dragging out negotiations. The sources did not say how long Iran would allow for talks to progress before responding. Iran, 2 of the sources said, was considering sending a representative to the ceasefire talks, in what would be a first since the war started in Gaza. The representative would not directly attend the meetings, but would engage in behind-the-scenes discussions to, quote, maintain a line of diplomatic communication with the US while negotiations proceed. Sounds quite grown up, to be honest. Officials in Washington, Qatar, and Egypt did not immediately respond to questions about whether Iran would play an indirect role in talks. 2 senior sources close to Lebanon's Hezbollah said Tehran would give the negotiations a chance, but would not give up its intentions to retaliate. A ceasefire in Gaza would give Iran cover for a smaller, quote, symbolic response, one of the sources said. That report may hold out some hope of de-escalating the situation in the region, but Western nations are continuing to up the pressure. In a separate statement issued by the White House yesterday, the US, UK, France, Germany, and Italy all stressed their commitment to defend Israel from any attack by Iran. When Iran last attacked Israel earlier this year, Britain, the US, and France all helped to protect Israel from a barrage of over 300 missiles, drones, and loitering munitions fired from Iran. In anticipation of a further attack, the US has now ordered a fleet of warships to accelerate their journey to the Middle East, while also deploying a nuclear-powered submarine to the region. Helena, I have strong feelings about this, but I'll come to you first. Why are the Western powers allowing Israel to put them into this kind of position?
Well, it's incredible in the statement was the release. They said that, well, Iran would bear responsibility if they retaliate when they've been given casus belli by Israel because they have killed a foreign dignitary on their sovereign territory after previously attacking their sovereign territory earlier in the year as well. So the idea that the person who is retaliating would bear responsibility in these cases is quite frankly a ridiculous claim to make in these circumstances. By all means, urge restraint should you wish to do so. We are all fearing the idea of a wider escalation within the Middle East that would have plenty of repercussions both now and in the future. But the idea that this is somehow just coming out of nowhere as far as Iran's concerned, as you see from the statement, which has no mention of Israel's actions whatsoever, is quite frankly ridiculous. And always, even though the EU states have made their own kind of, or European states, I guess, in Britain's case, have made the statement together in this particular instance, really and truly, of course, the United States is at the center of this entire discussion. Still, of course, we've discussed many times how, as far as Netanyahu's concerned, the war cannot end. Anything that would end the war ends his political career, so he must extend it as far as possible. With voices in the White House changing their tune, especially with the election coming up and a potential very, very slight change in strategy in terms of continually giving support to Israel completely without any caveats, but also pushing for a ceasefire and an end to the conflict, which Kamala is slightly more interested in doing so than Joe Biden for electoral reasons, if anything. Fearing that change in strategy from the United States, Netanyahu is clearly being far more saber-rattling in terms of both the words that he uses and the actions that he has taken in trying to say, well, if there is a wider war, then there is literally no way that the USA doesn't back us in this case. And as every European state, including us, is completely beholden to the interests of the United States State Department, there's nothing else that they can do other than just go, well, I guess we just have to say, pretty please, Iran, can you just not do a strike? Whilst also, feigning complete ignorance over the actual reality of Israel's actions previously that have given Iran quite the justification to retaliate, as has been stated by Pezeshkian in the statements that we've seen so far. And it just shows you, again, as you've said 1,000 times, and I'll repeat again, we do not have independent foreign policy in this country. And it is clear in just how much this this kind of dysfunctional relationship between the US State Department and Netanyahu, where he seems to be really kind of pulling the string as far as it can go, has gigantic repercussions for not only the safety of people in the Middle East, but also our diplomatic relations with countries within that area as well. And what we are left with is a completely intractable situation where a pariah state has been created because no one wants to tell them no. And what the solution is to this situation, it beats me, to be honest.
It also really exposes the bullshit and hypocrisy at the heart of the quote-unquote rules-based international order. Let's go through this, by the way, with Iran. You have Qasem Soleimani, one of the most senior military officers in the Iranian military establishment. He's not in the formal Iranian army, the Yatesh. He was in the Revolutionary Guard. He headed up something called the Quds Force, their extraterritorial unit, a bit like the SAS, although much bigger. And of course, the SAS would say not as effective, man to man. He was killed in Iraq. He was operating in Iraq with the explicit permission of the democratically elected government of Iraq. He was part of a mission to help defeat ISIS with US support, USAF support, about a decade ago, in Tikrit, famously. So you had the US Air Force providing support to this man. He was so evil that they fought alongside him to beat ISIS. He's killed by US drone strike. You have Iranian diplomats in Syria, like you say, Helena, sovereign Iranian territory. They're killed. You then have the leader of a foreign entity, you'd say a country, but of course, Palestine, of course, is a nation. It's not a recognized nation state for much of the world, certainly not the United States. He's killed on Iranian sovereign territory while marking the death of the Iranian president. And the idea that if you respond to that, you're somehow breaching the rules-based international order, you're the bad guy, how dare you, is off the charts. The people who are completely at odds with the quote-unquote rules-based international order are the Israelis, are the Americans. I find the inclusion, by the way, of the Italians in the communique from the White House particularly interesting, because Italy, bear in mind, earlier this year, stopped the export of weapon sales to Israel. Britain, and I agree with you, Helena, we don't have an independent foreign policy, but clearly Starmer has made something of a choice with regards to how Israel behaves towards Palestinians, so on UNRWA, on the ICC stuff, on weapon sales to Israel. Britain's come out in a certain direction. But then when it comes to Israel's security in West Asia, we're squarely behind, certainly not shoulder to shoulder with the United States. And it is, I think, going to cost us goodwill and trust and faith amongst much of the global South for not years to come, for decades to come. For decades to come. You can't appeal to the quote-unquote rules-based international order if a country can be attacked like Iran has been multiple times, and yet they can't do anything in retaliation as an act of deterrence for future acts, lest they be the bad guys. This isn't a Marvel film. People aren't dumb. The majority of the global public knows what the score is. Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump and ex-owner Elon Musk have broadcast a 2-hour conversation on X. Billed as an interview, the event was less of a grilling and more a fireside chat. And it got off to a bumpy start, with technical glitches causing it to be delayed by around 40 minutes. Musk blamed that on a coordinated cyber attack, of course he did, calling it an attempt to silence Donald Trump. But it wasn't long before Trump was given ample opportunity to attack his Democratic opponent, Kamala Harris.
She wants to have open borders, and now she's going like she's tough on the border. It's such a lie.
Yeah, this is simply not true. This is simply not true.
And everybody knows it's not true. It's a disgrace that she can say it.
No, I mean, obviously, what's happening sort of overnight is they're rewriting history and making Kamala sound like a moderate when in fact she is far left, like far left.
Worse than Bernie Sanders. She is considered more liberal by far than Bernie Sanders. She's a radical left lunatic. And if she's going to be our president, very quickly, you're not going to have a country anymore. And she'll go back to all of the things that she believes in. She believes in defunding the police. She believes in no fracking, zero. Now all of a sudden she's saying, no, I really want to see fracking. if they got in, the day she got in, she'll end fracking. And by the way, if people didn't think that, the lunatics that really believe in that, they won't vote for her. You know, like the Palestinians and Israel. She is so anti-Israel, and she's bad for both. Biden actually did something that was impossible. Both sides hate him. You know, both sides. That was a hard thing to do. Unification.
Yeah, no. I mean, Netanyahu came to give a talk to a joint Senate and House sitting, and I was there, and Kamala stood him up. You know, what does that say?
I think it's highly disrespectful. And I say, if you're a Jewish person, or if you believe in Israel, if you're a person that, you know, is very pro-Israel, if you vote for her, it's worse than Biden. And Biden was bad. But if you vote for her, you ought to have your head examined.
America first, except if it's Israel. America first. But if you don't go and listen to what Benjamin Netanyahu has to say, then I can't vote for you. But remember, America first. Now, that wasn't the only time immigration came up in the conversation. Musk has been actively exaggerating the impact of immigration on the UK online over the last 2 weeks. And elsewhere in that interview, Trump played up to that theme, promising the largest deportation program in US history if he's elected. In response to those and other comments, Kamala Harris's campaign spokesperson released this statement. Donald Trump's extremism and dangerous Project 2025 agenda is a feature, not a glitch of his campaign, which was on full display for those unlucky to listen in tonight during whatever that was on X.com. Trump's entire campaign is in service of people like Elon Musk and himself, self-obsessed rich guys who will sell out the middle class and who cannot run a live stream in the year 2024. Project 2025 is a proposal that came out of the Heritage Foundation. That's a conservative US think tank. It calls for the sacking of thousands of civil servants, expanding the power of the president, halting sales of the abortion pill, and a mass crackdown on immigration. And while Trump has distanced himself from Project 2025, its proponents include many of his former advisors. Over the course of the conversation, other political themes included relations with China and Russia, pharmaceutical licensing, and environmental politics. It was on that topic that the risks of nuclear power came up.
So, like, after Fukushima happened in Japan, people were asking me in California, you know, are we worried about like a nuclear cloud coming from Japan? I'm like, no, that's crazy. It's not even dangerous in Fukushima. I actually flew there and ate locally grown vegetables on TV to prove it. And I donated a solar water treatment, a solar powered system for a water treatment plant. And
but you haven't been feeling so well lately, and I'm worried about it.
No, but I mean,
I'm only kidding.
It's fine, you know. It's like Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed, but now they're like full cities again. So
right.
it's really not something that, you know.
That's great.
So it's not as scary as people think, basically.
Nuclear holocaust, it's not so bad. I have low mental bandwidth right now. Like I say, I think I'm partly sick and it's partly the heat. But my goodness, you can hear the low resolution with which their thinking is working here. Huh? The chat was so long, there was even time for Elon Musk to pitch Donald Trump for a future job.
Well, I mean, I think it would be great to just have a government efficiency commission that takes a look at these things and just ensures that the taxpayer money, the taxpayers' hard-earned money, is spent in a good way. And I'd be happy to help out on such a commission.
I'd love
if it were formed.
Well, you're the greatest cutter. I mean, I look at what you do. You walk in and you just say, "You want to quit?" They go on strike. I won't mention the name of the company, but they go on strike, and you say, "That's okay. You're all gone. You're all gone." So every one of you is gone, and you are the greatest. You would be very good. Oh, you would love it.
You are the greatest cutter. You will love. You are great. You will love it. Okay, you are the greatest cutter. By the way, this time next week, Donald Trump will be at some event. Here we are. A lot of people are saying it. I am the greatest cutter. Well, he said it was Elon Musk here, so remember that one when he pulls that out of his ass. That was possibly a reference to allegations that workers at Tesla another of Musk's companies, although that's a publicly listed company, have previously been fired for attempting to organize at US sites. And it earned both men a lawsuit from the United Auto Workers Union, one of the largest in the US. It's filed federal labor charges against Trump and Musk for what it calls their illegal attempts to threaten and intimidate workers considering strike action. And UAW President Sean Fain said this: "When we say Donald Trump is a scab, this is what we mean. When we say Trump stands against everything our union stands for, this is what we mean. Donald Trump will always side against workers standing up for themselves, and he will always side with billionaires like Elon Musk, who is contributing $45 million a month to a super PAC to get him elected. Both Trump and Musk want working class people to sit down and shut up, and they laugh about it openly. It's disgusting, illegal, and totally predictable from these two clowns." Tell us what you really think. Pretty, in a way, almost a Trumpian statement there. I quite like that. Disgusting, illegal, and totally predictable from these two clowns, certainly that. If you were hoping that the hard-hitting questions came at the end of that 2-hour interview, well, prepare to be disappointed, because here's how it ended.
And I just want to congratulate you. You've done an amazing job. You have definitely got a fertile mind. You know, we can talk. You and I can talk about rockets.
Well, it's kind of you to say. Thank you.
Tunnels. We can talk about tunnels and rockets and electric cars. So many things. And now you're into the AI, and that's going to be another beauty, I'll say. So it's an amazing thing you've done, Elon. It's an amazing thing, and I congratulate you.
I mean, thank you. And I just say here, here's to an exciting, inspiring future that people can look forward to and be optimistic and excited about what happens next. And that's the kind of future that I think you will bring as president, and that's why I endorse you.
Well, I appreciate that. That endorsement meant a lot to me. Not all endorsements mean that much, to be honest. Your endorsement meant a lot. And, we have a phrase, make America great again. It's pretty simple, but it really says that we want to make America great again. And we can do it. We can do it now. But if we were going to suffer another 4 years like we've suffered for the last 4 years, I'm not sure the country can ever come back. That's how bad it is. It's so bad. We have to do a lot of things.
I think that's a very real risk.
Yeah, it's a big risk.
That's a very real risk.
Yeah.
Helena, they say this every time, don't they? Look, if we lose this time, there ain't no coming back from it. We had it in 2016, 2020. We're hearing it now in 2024. Firstly, on that final point, what did you make of the nature of this conversation in terms of how it was summed up by that very cordial sort of tone between Musk and Trump? Is this a sign that Trump is desperate? Is this a sign that actually he's somewhat surprised with the pick of Waltz as VP, the, you might say, unfair media fanfare surrounding Kamala Harris? We can talk about that more in a moment, but it's certainly real. Her polling has certainly improved. It's certainly much better than Joe Biden. Do you think this is a response to actually real concern on the part of the Republican candidate?
Oh, 100%, absolutely. It's a clear sign of weakness, not him coming back to Twitter in general, but also having this conversation too, not believing that he can just bleat into Truth Social, get his base ready, and then just win the election like he was going to do against Joe Biden. He even mentioned in the talk that they had, he keeps moaning really and truly about this. He's really whinging about, they got rid of Joe Biden, it's terrible, they did a coup, it's the first time they've ever done a coup. And I'm like, no, they just realized that the candidate wasn't going to win, so they changed it. It's not difficult to understand the strategy that's going on there. So he's clearly quite rattled, and it shows that he realizes that, he's dropping in the polls in terms of policy. Like, one of the attack lines from Tim Waltz has been, Republicans are weird, but their weirdness is a function of the fact they care too much about culture or shit and don't have any actual real policy for anything. Like, they don't have a healthcare plan, they don't have anything. And the campaign is really kind of not hitting any kind of real demographics who are swing voters. You saw him try and speak to the black journalist. He wasn't getting involved or trying to win over people in that demographic. It was a complete failure. So his campaign is really on the rocks, and he can see this. Although I did watch listen to all of the conversation between Musk and Trump. I watched Hassan react to it, actually. And you know what really struck me about it? Just how boring these people are. Just how dull. Like, it was billed as being some kind of friendly chat. And believe me, it was friendly. But Elon is so kind of cucked out to Trump as a political figure that he spent the entire time just letting Trump do his stump speech, just repeating the talking points that he does on the campaign trail over and over and over again. A couple of interjections here and there, very kind of meekly from Elon, really and truly. In fact, to the point at which he almost kind of went back on his support of electric vehicles and the green transition that he says that he believes in, just because Trump said that he favored oil and gas because that was the cause of inflation, quote unquote, nothing to do with the problems of the pandemic or whatever. And so, he didn't really interject at all and just allowed Trump to use it as a campaigning platform. I mean, it's clear why, right? There's a reason why there was a mention of unions specifically in this conversation, or at least references to unions, even tangentially. Elon Musk admitted before, when he officially did this kind of Zoom meeting where he said, I am now endorsing the Republican candidate, and he specifically said the Democrats have been captured by the class action lawyers and the trade unions. Now, you can just tell from the way in which Elon Musk talks about this, that he is scared of the kind of action that Tesla had in places like Sweden, for example, where the Swedish workers had this really long, really drawn-out union dispute with the Tesla manufacturing plant over there, which was broad scale. There were sympathy strikes all across the country to try and ensure that bits and pieces of Tesla cars weren't delivered to the factory. And so Elon Musk is clearly really kind of put upon by trade unions in a way that he was kind of aloof towards before. Of course, every capitalist despises unions, but Elon is a bit of an idiot, so I don't think he really truly knew what was going on in these labor disputes when he was only doing business in the United States. Having to deal with that in a European country has made him really, really angry at the idea of trade unionism, and it's made him come out against what very little, at least some, trade union support that you get from the Democratic Party. What this does do, though, is that this open discussion about how unions are bad and how firing workers is good, that's even worse for the Trump campaign. The swing states that are going to matter in the election in November are Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania in the Rust Belt. What is the biggest thing in the Rust Belt? It's industrial workers. It's why it's called the Rust Belt. What's important about industrial jobs? These are the most heavily unionized sectors in the United States. They voted for Trump because Hillary Clinton didn't move away from the lack of industrial strategy, the lack of investment in these areas, and the lack of union support. That's why they voted for Trump, because he said he would bring the jobs back. Obviously, he didn't do that. And now that Trump is going on the offensive against their trade union bargaining rights, this is going to destroy the Trump campaign in the most important swing states. So not only is he weak in terms of the way in which the campaign has happened thus far, but his future campaigning platform, if this is where he's going to go, in line with Elon Musk, Tim Walz attacking people like J.D. Vance, people like for being venture capitalists, I don't think that's going to play well with the key demographic of voters that he needs to win over if he wants to win the election in November.
I think that's so important. Let's look at the two key messages here of Trump in 2016 when he wins. Make America great again. I'm going to fire loads of people, firing loads of people. So you've got economic renewal, protectionism, economic nationalism. Now he's saying you're the greatest cutter. America first, and he's talking incessantly about Israel. There's deep, deep contradictions here, and obviously Biden couldn't exploit that. Kamala Harris is going to struggle too, let's be honest. But Tim Walz, I think, is a real shock to the system, and I think he's certainly a variable. And I have to say, there was a column by Janan Ganesh in the FT, about a week ago, which I don't often say these words. I agreed with. I think that Trump embroiling himself with the Silicon Valley bros, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk now, has real political downsides for him. I think it makes him look weird. I think it normalizes what are ultimately quite weird things to the American electorate, weird ideas, weird stories, weird policies. And I think it really underscores a disconnect that he has with the country at large. Now, he's worked for decades to have that sense of connection with blue-collar Americans. They know him. He thinks he knows them. I think to an extent that's true. Blue-collar Republican voters are very much his people. He knows them like a psychic looking into a crystal ball. He demonstrated that in 2016 with his comments, for instance, around immigration. Right from the start, he won that nomination. Nobody expected it for the Republican candidacy. He then wins the race for the White House. Of course, he loses the popular vote. That's absolutely the case. And it feels to me that he's going off course by talking to all these weird people about all these weird things, really distilled by the selection of J.D. Vance for vice president. You compare him to Waltz, it's like chalk and cheese. What are you doing? So who knows? This new alliance of Trump and Silicon Valley, maybe that's the thing that loses it for him. It certainly is coming with some real downsides. And some people say, well, you're criticizing these two men. One's worth $250 billion. Musk is worth around $220 billion. And of course, Trump is so successful. If they're stupid, what does that make you? Look, Donald Trump inherited several $100 million. By the way, I didn't pay a penny on inheritance tax at the start of a decades-long historic bull market in US property. It's hard not to make money under those circumstances. Dare I say, I think most people in Novara Media would have done better. Of course, I would say that. I'm sure Helena would have done much, much better. Tom Tugendhat is one of a number of Tory MPs hoping to become the next Conservative leader. He's a former security minister and is from the party's more liberal One Nation wing. Today, he gave his first speech of the campaign, and the topic was crime. More specifically, last week's far-right riots, which have seen so far almost 800 people arrested for public disorder. That's led to complaints, amplified by influential voices online like Elon Musk, that the British police are guilty of two-tier policing, treating some demographics more harshly than others. This is what Tugendhat had to say about that suggestion.
Claiming there is two-tier policing, some critics of the police have compared the recent riots with the anti-Israel marches in London, or the direct action by Just Stop Oil. But that's not quite right. There is a difference between public protests in which a minority turned violent and disorder started deliberately by those intent on violence. There is a difference between blocking a road, even if that's a dangerous and selfish criminal act, and plotting to burn down shops, mosques and hotels, or carrying weapons on the streets. The right comparison for these riots is with 2011. Then, the police were robust, and the judges, quite rightly, very tough.
Arguably, the judges were tougher than they are now. We'll talk about that more in a moment. Now, Tugendhat is right that the race riots of last week were nothing like the protests in defense of Palestine or Just Stop Oil's actions against the climate crisis. But he still couldn't resist throwing a bone to those who continue to assert that the police treat some groups differently from others.
The approach to public order policing has been inconsistent and, too often, too weak. There was inaction in the face of blatant criminality during the anti-Israel protests. And the justification for not wanting to ban these marches was that the threshold in the Public Order Act 1986 was not reached. But if the Chief Constable did not believe banning the marches would prevent serious public disorder, how could they later claim that how could they later claim that arresting lawbreakers at the time would lead to wider disorder? This is quite obviously a contradiction. Last week, we saw a senior officer from West Midlands Police explain that officers had been absent during violence by young Muslim men because they had discussed their plans with, and I quote, community leaders to understand the style of policing we needed to deliver. Now, criminal acts committed during protests, whether by Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, or the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, were not stopped with police seeming to stand aside by the wayside. And in Birmingham, police deferred to so-called community leaders while pubs and cars were attacked, windows broken and citizens intimidated. This is not, as the police oath requires, policing without fear or favour. No police officer should ever tolerate the presence of a militia, no matter what the provocation or the cause they claim. The intrusion of politics, the politics of protest, or the politics of the self-appointed community leaders into policing must simply end.
And no politics in policing. Police but I would rather not have certain protests I disagree with happening. Tugendhat appears to be running his campaign from the centre-right, even using his speech to call out Conservative Party threat and reform leader, of course, Nigel Farage is the person I'm talking about, for encouraging last week's violence. Helena, this was a really interesting story for me because, look, I'm somewhat familiar with Tugendhat. I'm particularly aware of his positioning on foreign policy issues, understandably. He's an ex-military officer, but he's been very loud on China, on Taiwan, on Russia. But the minute he starts to talk about domestic political affairs, he just sounds incredibly lightweight. And I'm going to use the word. He doesn't seem very smart, which is kind of necessary, you'd think, if you're going to lead the Conservative Party. But then again, I suppose Liz Truss was the person in that job, the last but one. What's your read on this?
I mean, I think in terms of how he would position himself and the party moving forward, I mean, I think he's probably the most likely to bring the Conservative Party back to some kind of political relevance politically. He certainly, as a person, has broad appeal, kind of viscerally to the electorate. You mentioned, obviously, his history serving with the military, I think, in terms of the way in which he comports himself, in terms of how he appeals to the public. He's certainly far less abrasive than a Badenoch or a Patel, for example. He's certainly somebody I think at least tries to feel like that he can appeal to as many people as possible. And interestingly enough, I actually think one of the things that would make him far more likely to be able to make the Conservative Party into a politically relevant force again is he's actually on the advisory board of the Social Market Foundation. And this is a very centrist think tank, specifically an economic one as well. So maybe whilst his rhetoric in terms of domestic policy might be kind of neither here nor there, in terms of the history and how he approaches, especially economic policy, which, to be true, is where the Conservative Party lost the election. All this kind of yammering about, all of the kind of culture war stuff, people weren't interested in this come the election. We all kind of knew this really and truly when it came down to people's issues. And they really failed on failing to deal with things like public services and the cost of living. And coming from somewhere like the Social Market Foundation, which is far less right-wing than the Centre for Policy Studies or the Institute for Economic Affairs or Policy Exchange, where even right-wing Labour MPs are on the advisory board, like that's the kind of area of policy that I think would be able to make people trust the Conservatives on the economy again. Because really and truly, that is where they lose huge amounts of trust. Not just broken promises, but they have shown that they cannot be trusted to run the economy anymore. So we shall see whether or not he personally can put his opinions to the public well. You probably have more experience than I do in seeing his previous public speaking appearances on domestic policy. But the actual cards that he brings to the table in terms of where he would position the Conservative Party on the most salient issue in basically every election, which is the economy, I think he has a leg up on the kind of disaster capitalism of a Kemi Badenoch, or the kind of the upfront nastiness of somebody like Mel Stride, or James Cleverly's kind of intimate connection to the failures of the previous Conservative Party. So I think that if the Conservative Party want to moderate themselves more broadly and try and broaden their appeal again, I think Tugendhat is a good candidate for that.
It's an interesting take, isn't it? I mean, I'm inclined to agree, but then I think, look, I look at Tugendhat, Helena, and I look at Jeremy Hunt, and it's like he's a Wilco, he's a Home Bargains version of Jeremy Hunt, who's obviously got a very senior job for now, who, by the way, according to Conservative Home yesterday, was the second most popular Tory politician amongst Tory party members. So why would you go for the bootleg version when you can have the real deal? What's your response quickly on that, Helena? I mean, if you had a choice between Jeremy Hunt and Tom Tugendhat, given the variables you're talking about, trying to reach out to the centre, and look, neither might be able to win an election, but they can certainly claw back dozens of seats they just lost, which is certainly something. Where's the argument for Tugendhat when you've got a more effective politician who's broadly similar? Sorry.
I think the only issue really there is just that if this was in a complete vacuum, that's 100% correct. And I would really absolutely agree with you in terms of Jeremy Hunt's, also his long kind of history of being at the forefront of politics. But that is also his downside now. You've got to remember the Conservative Party burned huge swathes of the electorate over the last 5 years, really and truly. The only people who were really voting for them were over 65s. In under 45s, for example, they were in fifth place. And as Chancellor of the Exchequer, he was intimately connected to the the halls of policy that specifically pushed away voters from across the political spectrum. Young people hate conservative economic policy for basically every reason, because they craft economic policy specifically to piss off these groups of people. And then people from the 40 to 65 range are the most likely to be mortgage holders who were burnt by the failures of the mini budget. And then, of course, the fact that interest rates stayed high for so long whilst Jeremy Hunt was Chancellor of the Exchequer. So whilst I think he probably is a better political operator, I think you're absolutely right, and is probably more popular within the Conservative Party, it's going to be really difficult to extricate him from the time when people couldn't afford to put food on the table and he was the person in charge of the economy. And that unfortunately, that just doesn't wash away very easily in my mind.
His time's come and gone. Oh, I should say, I mean, I was in beautiful Godalming during the last general election. Of course, his seat is Godalming and Ash, Jeremy Hunt. And I was shocked he kept it. And I think that really is a testament to his personal ability to campaign, which, again, it counts for something, right? He should have lost that seat. The Lib Dems won every single target they had, every single one, except there. You know, they won identical seats, which were harder on paper, Chichester, Winchester. They hadn't won Chichester in 100 years. But he held on in Godalming, which surprised me. And, you know, when you've got 24% in a national election, your lowest ever, that's pretty impressive. Elsewhere on the Tory leadership front, former Tory Chancellor David Gauke has given this advice to leadership hopefuls. The Conservatives do need to win back many of their previous voters who have defected to Reform. But the assumption of many Tories is that they need to become more like Reform to do so. There is an alternative approach, which is to expose the thuggery and extremism that, at the very least, is tolerated within the party. When Farage is caught disseminating baseless internet rumours, when he gives succour to the rioters but by denying that the far right is the issue, when he appears to favour the rule of the mob over the rule of law, he should be taken on. It is time for the Tories to expose him for what he is. It's an interesting take. I'd certainly be inclined to agree. Helena, where are you on this?
Well, I think this is the strategy. This is absolutely the strategy that they should be employing in a vacuum, at the very least, if they want to be competitive at the election. They cannot, in any sense of the word, try and curry favour with, I think it's around about 40% of Reform UK voters who feel that the rioters speak for them, for example. There was polling that came out by More in Common yesterday about this. And it's not even a plurality of Reform UK voters who feel like the rioters spoke for them or had their similar grievances in mind. So there's a very large proportion of Reform UK voters who can be won over by driving a wedge, specifically over Reform UK's connections to the misinformation that was spread, which was also in this polling named as the biggest reason for the riots happening. The biggest named reason that people within this polling said for why these riots happened was the spread of misinformation, was the casting of doubt over the identity of the perpetrator in Southport, for example. And Nigel Farage playing kind of fast and loose with trying to have a nuanced response to this and leaving these questions up in the air. That can certainly be a wedge that you can drive between the moderate Reform UK supporters and the more hardline Reform UK supporters. And the moderates are the plurality in this instance. So trying to win these people over is definitely a way that you can help re-solidify the Conservative brand for these kinds of voters, although how many of them might vote Tory remains to be seen. And on top of this, if they did it the other way, if they tried to appeal to that other sector of Reform UK voters, they would then immediately lose all of the Lib Dem and Labour switchers from the last election, who are already very moderate and would never vote for the Conservatives at the last election over their failure on the economy. And if they move even further right towards the cultural end of things, it's going to be even harder to win over people within the centre ground. So there is clearly a wedge that they can drive by taking on Reform directly and saying, no, if you want common sense, quote-unquote, compassionate conservatism, if you can imagine such a thing, but that's a line that they go with, you cannot vote for the hardline Reform. Farage has ruined his perception. And the polling shows this too. You mentioned this on stream last week, which was that Farage's personal approval rating is in the tank. Right? I mean, I say in the tank, it's dropped at the very least. He's doing worse in terms of public perception. So taking this and running with it to break apart the Reform UK coalition and say, no, we have a future plan to win over the moderate Reform UK supporters is the only way. It's the only way that they can be politically relevant. Because if they try and take on Reform UK's rhetoric, they're going to be chasing in a very, very small pool of voters.
I think that's so true. I think that something like Kemi Badenoch is going to create space to the right of the Conservative Party, which if you're Nigel Farage, you are going to love. Britain's universities have been struggling for a while, but that situation is now coming to a head. A combination of COVID and inflation has squeezed the sector's already narrow margins. Meanwhile, Labour has said fees for domestic students can't rise any further. In all, that spells disaster for the higher education sector. So it's no surprise that half of Britain's universities are now running a deficit. In 2018, Sir Philip Auger chaired an independent panel reviewing the funding of higher education. He's now told the Financial Times that universities will need to cut costs to survive and that bailouts and even turnaround teams may be required. By his own estimates, he reckons that around 70 of Britain's 140 universities are running deficits. In other words, they're spending more than they make. He added that a, quote, handful of institutions were in danger of breaching financial covenants and would likely need rescuing. So, with a month before the new academic year is set to start, bailouts of universities are a very real possibility. That is, of course, if some of them don't just collapse altogether. Now, the primary driver in all of this is international students. Many universities have seen a fall in foreign applications by as much as 50%, partly as a result of recent changes to student visas by the last Conservative government. Between that and inflation, the pressure is mounting, so much so that, according to the UCU, 69 universities have already announced course closures, job cuts, and voluntary redundancy programs ahead of the new year. Aberystwyth in Wales is looking to cut 200 jobs. Coventry has to make 100 million in savings. Kiel has opened a voluntary redundancy scheme inviting 2,300 staff members. Northampton has opened a voluntary severance scheme to 500 individuals. Sheffield has put 100 jobs in the Nuclear Research Centre at risk of redundancy. Portsmouth has put 400 members of staff at risk of redundancy too. The more you dig, the more you read, the worse it looks. And, as if to confirm what is happening, last week the university's regulator, the Office for Students, announced a contract of up to £4 million for professional services companies to manage a potential wave of insolvencies. And this is the part you really need to pay attention to. The OFS, Office for Students, is seeking to procure capacity to undertake financial risk and transformation planning assessments of HE providers. The objective is to evaluate the financial health and the management and governance capability of HE providers to ensure that the interests of students are safeguarded throughout any financial adjustments or transition, including potential market exits. That is the key phrase. Market exits. Financial adjustment and transition is bad enough. You have big turnaround teams come in, they lay lots of people off, you close lots of departments, but at least at the end of it, you still have a university. Market exits would indicate that the university, well, it simply closes. Helena, Bridget Phillipson, the new Labour minister with this portfolio, has said there will be no bailouts in higher education. If that's true, and that's a position that Labour stick to, it does increasingly feel like we're going to see universities being closed, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I think there probably will be closures. And it's really important to understand this is a political choice. If they wanted to have the money to be able to bail out universities and try and have more central funding again, that thing that we used to have for universities, they could do that if they had the political will to do so. But they don't have the political will to do that, unfortunately. We're in full austerity mode in Rachel Reeves land. But whilst I have plenty of criticisms of the Labour government and the Labour Party in general, we really have to take this whole problem with universities and university funding and the future of universities at the feet of the Conservative government for the last 14 years, and they should take the lion's share of the blame for this. Boris Johnson, of all things, actually was pretty wise in terms of university places. In 2019, he specifically said that he wanted to make us global Britain, a place that anybody could be able to come and study and make a home for themselves. And he instituted a policy of relaxing the visa rules to allow lots of new international students to come here and essentially help subsidize a bunch of very expensive university departments for UK students to have capped fees for, whilst international students paid capped fees for. But this has been massively rolled back, and there's loads of different reasons for this. First of all, within the media, we keep hearing this figure, 700,000 net migration, right? The media fixates on this very specific individual figure without talking about the fact that, a very large amount of these people who have migrated here, these are foreign students, and the families of foreign students. They're not going to be here forever, for example. Like, a large proportion of these will study for 3 years and they'll go back home. So this is a misdirection in terms of how we discuss the large numbers of migrants. But of course, nothing is more important than short-term political capital. So what do? We take something that's really important to keep our universities afloat, like having international students, and we get rid of them to satiate electoral rims rather than taking actual kind of common sense decisions on the future of a really important institution. And of course, these institutions have been under attack by the Conservative government for 14 years because they create lots of people who don't vote Conservative a lot of the time. And the Tories have been obsessed with the idea that young people don't vote Tory because they're being indoctrinated by woke lefty academics, to the point at which, literally, I believe someone from Policy Exchange that you wrote about, Aaron, tried to do a study to find out why people were being radicalized by universities, only to prove that it wasn't true in the first place. But you've seen that in terms of why they don't want people going to university. They attack the Mickey Mouse degrees. They try and make it even harder to be able to afford the repayments by changing how they get repaid and how the loans work, and then also try and just disincentivize people from going there in the first place, whether they're from the UK or whether they're from abroad. Let's be really fundamentally clear what this is. This is economic vandalism. One of our biggest comparative advantages internationally in terms of trade is our education sector. We have one of the best education sectors in the world. The fact that people will come here, take foreign capital to spend on our education system, this is an export good if they're using foreign capital to buy it, bringing foreign capital to the UK to support their families, to pay for their studies, paying taxes in this country. We have a giant trade deficit. And because of the Conservative Party's cultural nonsense that they've been pushing for all of this time, we are taking a gigantic economic hit by a huge drop in international students, which is making our trade deficit even worse and leading to some of the most important institutions in this country and also globally closing down. I'm really furious about this because we didn't have any reasonable discussion about what would be the result of getting rid of these visas at all. There was no serious discussion. It was just net migration figure has to come down. That's it. That's the only thing that mattered. And we never have a sensible conversation about it. And now we're at the point where universities might close. And that'll mean people out of jobs. That'll mean people have fewer opportunities. And that will mean our economy will be worse. It's ridiculous.
I mean, that's really vital. In terms of the exports, this country doesn't have many exports. It's very good in terms of exports of services. And part of that is things like, yes, of course, financial, legal services, but also higher education. There's that. But also, many towns and cities with these university campuses, if they close, it is akin to a town in the northeast losing its coal mine 40 years ago. Or it's akin to Glasgow or Belfast or trying to think of shipping areas, Liverpool with regards to changes in the docks and with shipping and with maritime shipbuilding, like in the northeast as well, Newcastle as well. Shipbuilding, that's the kind of hit you're looking at. If you take, what is in many cases after the council, the biggest employer out of the local economy, stuff's going to get really bad really quickly. And very, very, very briefly on this point, the idea that, they're Mickey Mouse universities with Mickey Mouse degrees, they need to fail. I mean, I'm sure you can make that argument if you want to. I'm sure there are some departments which probably shouldn't exist. Okay, fine. I'm not going to name those departments, but you might say, well, if you integrate those with other departments, the academics can earn more. There's a better learning experience. Of course, efficiencies and improvements are always possible. Of course, they're always possible. That's just a simple fact. But the idea that we need to close down large numbers of universities, large numbers of departments is simply, I think, wrong. And the reason why many of these institutions are in such a pickle right now is because, firstly, they presume the cheap credit of the last 14 years, very low interest rates, was permanent. They fucked up big time, presuming that. And they thought that foreign students coming over here, uninterrupted, would never stop. They also screwed that up big time. Then on top of that, you had a funding arrangement for domestic students, which was insane after 2010. You had this increase in fees from £3,000 to £9,000, but it became such a politicized issue that no government really wants to increase it more than £9,250. And you've got inflation. Inflation's real. Your staff want pay rises, goods and services, energy, internet, construction costs. These all go up, but you can't ask for more than £9,200 from your domestic students each year. So that funding arrangement post-2010, which, by the way, any sensible person thought was ridiculous, combined with the loose credit and people thinking it was going to last forever, combined with the idea that foreign students would be coming over in the same numbers forever, finally combined with the utter abject uselessness of the people running universities in this country, often mediocre or failed academics, basically pretended they were FTSE 250 CEOs for a few years because they had loads of money to spend. Oh, I'm the big corporate business exec. No, you're a very mediocre English literature academic. You shouldn't be in charge of these kinds of budgets. In combination, that has screwed so many perfectly decent universities. Great example, Portsmouth, they're talking about laying off 400 people, or 400 people are being negotiated with for redundancy, including 50 academics. They are intending to spend £250 million, £250 million over the next 10 years on buildings. You're laying off academics, right? But you're going to spend £250 million on buildings? There's no point having big shiny buildings if you've got no teaching going on inside. But of course, it's about corporate vanity. It's about your legacy as a fake FTSE 250 exec, when really, like I say, you're just a mediocre failing academic. I do feel very strongly about this. And you're totally right, Helena. Somehow, over the last 15 years, our political class, by the way, cheer-led to the rafters by much of the media, have completely screwed over what should be a massive, or has been, a massive national success story in this country. And of course, I'm talking about higher education. Last month, a judge sentenced 5 individuals of the direct action group Just Stop Oil. They had been found guilty of conspiracy to cause a public nuisance after organising protests that brought the M25 to a standstill over 4 days in 2022. 4 of those individuals received 4-year sentences, while another, JSO founder Roger Hallam, was given 5 years. In his concluding remarks, the presiding judge, Christopher Haniyeh, claimed the accused had, quote, crossed the line from concerned campaigner to fanatic. At the time, those sentences were widely regarded as extraordinarily punitive, especially so given the leniency of Haniyeh on previous occasions, which included one case where he chose not to give a custodial sentence to an on-duty police officer who had a threesome with a drunk woman after she was ejected from a nightclub. The JSO prisoners have now started the process of appealing those sentences, highlighting the obvious disparity between themselves and some of those involved in race riots earlier this month. The Times reports this. The activists will argue that the sentences were, quote, manifestly excessive and that the judge appears to have punished the defendants for disobeying his orders not to explain their motivations for taking such action. They will also argue that they were barred from producing evidence of the immediate threat posed by climate change. The Times also understands that campaign groups are planning a new wave of action calling for the release of climate activists from the UK's prisons. Meanwhile, a spokesperson for Defend Our Juries said this. Both the recent race riots and the filling of our prisons with climate truth tellers result from the previous government's attempt to distract from the existential crises we face by demonizing easy targets. It's time to leave that toxic legacy behind and to bring people together with an honest confrontation with reality. So is this claim of two-tier sentencing against climate activists fair? Well, here are a few examples of those involved in recent race riots who were punished. This is Declan Guerin, 29 years old, and he's from Liverpool. He was found guilty of violent disorder and setting fire to a police vehicle. His punishment? 2 years, 5 months in prison. Or what about Liam James Riley? He was found guilty of racially aggravated abusive behaviour and violent disorder, and he got 20 months. Or finally, what about this chap, Ryan Wheatley? He assaulted a police officer in Southampton and got 1 year in prison. But don't worry, it could have been so much worse. They could have been on a Zoom call organising a protest about fossil fuel emissions. Helena, your thoughts on this? We've obviously just seen 3 individuals there who were sentenced by magistrates in the immediate aftermath of those race riots. Do you think that the obvious discrepancy here. Do you think that's going to help with these appeals made by the 5 JSO individuals?
I want it to, believe me, I do, but I don't think it will. The sentencing guidelines are pretty clear in terms of the conspiracy to commit public nuisance convictions that they have here. I really don't think that there's going to be much in terms of changing the actual result of what their sentences look like overall. But what I do think we will have is a change in public perception, especially of how indeed we are looking at the sentences for people who have engaged in disorder over the last couple of weeks or so, especially people who you set fire to police vehicles, for example, and only get half of the time that Roger Hallam got, for example. I think this will at least have there will be some sympathy. I think there'll be a lot more sympathy for Just Stop Oil in the broader political ramifications of this by saying, well, hang on a minute, people were really kind of were enjoying the long sentences that the Just Stop Oil conspirators, I guess you could call them, in terms of how the government viewed them. They really were in kind of reveling in the long sentences that were handed out to them, because they really were disliked by a lot of the public on this one. But I think that making these comparisons between the kind of sentences that people got for, engaging in far-right buggery, as Keir Starmer would call it, or in some cases terrorist attacks, what I would call it, and then comparing them to getting you half the sentences of somebody who essentially, as you say, helped organize a protest on a Zoom call. I think this will win more people over to Just Stop Oil's plight in terms of the unfairness here, even if it doesn't materially affect how long these sentences are held down. It also might make people think that the current government is not being hard enough on the rioters themselves. It may actually want people to see increased sentences for rioters rather than people thinking that Just Stop Oil have gotten off lightly, especially as we know one of the big kind of differences between us on the left and a lot of people as a median voter in this country is they're really heavy on law and order. They really do like punitive justice in terms of how we punish people. So I don't think that you really and truly will see much in terms of how Just Stop Oil get punished for these things, but we may see people come out wanting their harsher punishments for the people who've engaged in riots over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think that's true. It is interesting, isn't it? I think most people, you're right. I think most people, sorry, I'll say that again. I think you're right. I think most people would say, look, that's not an argument to reduce the sentences of the JSO activists, but actually somebody who's setting fire to a police car, 2 years, 5 months, really? Look, that might mean anything. It might mean he just tried one thing and it didn't work. Who knows? I'm not the CPS. But setting fire to a police vehicle, trying to violent disorder, maximum sentence 5 years, and you get 2 years, 5 months. Maybe he was a very good boy with lots of good personal recommendations from a lawyer, a doctor, an academic. They said he shouldn't go to prison. He's a really wonderful person. He's of massive benefit to society. But those sentences do look extraordinarily lenient by comparison, don't they? Helena, thanks for joining me this evening.
It's been an absolute pleasure as always, Aaron. Look forward to next time.
And thanks everyone for watching tonight. We'll be back tomorrow from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.